A 74-year-old man in faded jeans and a flannel shirt picks up a rifle that nobody on the range wanted to touch. The barrel is pitted. The stock is scratched down to bare wood in 3 places. The scope mount is held together with electrical tape and what looks like a prayer. Sergeant First Class Dominic Hale watches from the observation platform and almost laughs out loud. Almost. Because 30 seconds earlier, every single one of his elite snipers just failed the same qualification course that this old man is about to attempt. And when the first shot cracks across the desert and the steel target at 1100 yards rings like a church bell, Hale stops laughing. He stops breathing. Everyone does. If you respect those who served when no one was watching, comment the word steady right now and stay with me, because what happened next at Fort Irwin changed the way an entire sniper platoon thinks about marksmanship, humility, and what it really means to be a shooter. Harold Edward Creech was not supposed to be on the range that Tuesday morning. He was not supposed to be on the base at all. He had driven out to Fort Irwin from Barstow, California, a 40-minute trip through flat, pale desert, because his grandson, Specialist Evan Creech, had invited him to the unit family day scheduled for the following weekend. Harold got the dates wrong. He showed up 8 days early. Evan was in the field and unreachable. The gate guards confirmed Harold's dependent credentials, gave him a visitor badge, and told him he could wait at the reception building or drive back home. Harold said he would wait a bit, maybe walk around if that was allowed. They told him to stay on the main roads and out of restricted areas. Harold thanked them politely, bought a coffee from the PX, and somehow ended up walking toward the sound of gunfire. That was the thing about Harold. He had always walked toward gunfire. He just never talked about it. The sniper section of Bravo Company, 2nd Battalion, 11th Infantry Regiment, was conducting its biannual rifle requalification. This cycle introduced a new course of fire mandated by the division commander, a man named Colonel Marcus Voss, who had come back from a joint exercise with British Royal Marines convinced that American sniper teams were not training at sufficient distances. Voss added 3 stages to the standard qualification. Stage 7 required a first-round hit on a human silhouette steel target at 900 metres. Stage 8 pushed it to 1,000. Stage 9, the one that had everyone talking, demanded a hit at 1,100 metres on a half silhouette, roughly the size of a man's upper torso, in wind conditions that the range safety officer estimated at a variable 8 to 12 miles per hour, with a full-value crosswind from the south. The course was scored pass-fail. You had to clear every stage. There was no partial credit. In the 3 days since the new course had gone live, not a single shooter in the battalion had passed. That morning, 8 snipers from Bravo's sniper section attempted the course. These were not weekend hobbyists. Staff Sergeant Rick Paulson had graduated top of his class at the United States Army Sniper School at Fort Moore. Sergeant Anaya Torres had 2 deployments with confirmed engagements past 800 metres in real combat. Corporal Dylan Vick had won the battalion-level sniper competition 2 years running. They were serious professionals with serious equipment. Each shooter carried an M2010 enhanced sniper rifle, chambered in .300 Winchester Magnum, fitted with a Leupold Mark 5 HD scope, bipod-stabilized, shooting match-grade ammunition from a known lot. Every rifle had been zeroed that morning. Conditions were documented. Wind calls were made by trained spotters using Kestrel weather meters, and one by one, every single shooter failed at stage 9. 2 of them failed at stage 8. Paulson missed the 1,100-meter target by what his spotter estimated was 3 inches low and 2 inches right. Torres hit the frame but not the silhouette. Vick's round struck dirt 4 feet short. The platoon sergeant, Master Sergeant Orrin Blake, stood behind the line with his arms crossed and a look on his face like a man watching his house burn down. Nobody was laughing. Nobody was talking. And that was the exact moment Harold Creech walked up to the range. He came from the east, along the gravel service road, holding his coffee in one hand and shading his eyes with the other. He was wearing a plaid flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, work jeans, tan boots that had seen a decade of use, and a baseball cap with no logo on it. His face was deeply lined. His hands were thick and rough, the hands of a man who had worked with them every day of his life. He looked like exactly what most people assumed he was, a retired tradesman out for a walk, maybe a little confused about where he was. Specialist Cortez, pulling security on the range perimeter, stopped him. Harold showed his visitor badge and said he just wanted to watch for a bit if that was all right. Cortez radioed Blake. Blake, distracted and irritated from the morning's failures, told Cortez to let the old man stand behind the barricade as long as he stayed quiet and out of the way. Harold thanked Cortez, set his coffee on a fence post and stood where he was told. For 20 minutes he said nothing. He just watched. He watched the next rotation of shooters set up. He watched them adjust their scopes, check their dope cards, range the targets with laser rangefinders, and call wind with instruments that cost more than his truck. He watched Staff Sergeant Paulson attempt the course a second time. Paulson cleared stages 1 through 8 cleanly, then settled in behind his rifle for stage 9. Harold could see the tension in the man's shoulders, the way his breathing was too fast, the tiny muscular tremble in his firing hand that anyone who had done this long enough would recognize. The shot broke. The spotter called a miss. Paulson dropped his head onto the stock and exhaled a word that Harold pretended not to hear. Blake called a cold range and told the shooters to stand down for a 15-minute break. That was when Harold walked over to Blake and said something that made the Master Sergeant turn and stare at him. Harold said, "Your boys are fighting the wind instead of reading it." Blake looked at him for a long moment. Harold was a full head shorter than Blake, 20 years older than anyone else within a quarter-mile of the range, and had no visible credentials beyond a clip-on visitor badge. Blake asked him what he meant by that. Harold said the wind at the firing line was not the wind at the target. He said there was a thermal draft rising off the rock formation at about 700 metres that was pushing the crosswind into a quartering headwind for the last 400 metres of bullet flight, and that the shooter's wind calls were based on conditions at the muzzle, not conditions at the target. Blake stared at him again. Then he asked Harold how he knew that. Harold said he could see it in the mirage lines through the spotting scope if somebody let him look. Blake, not sure whether he was dealing with a lunatic or something else entirely, handed Harold a spotting scope. Harold lifted it to his eye, spent about 10 seconds scanning, and then described the wind pattern across the entire 1100-metre range in detail that made Blake's spotter, Corporal Vic, set down his kestrel and listen with his mouth slightly open. Blake asked Harold who he was. Harold said his name and that his grandson was in the battalion. Blake asked if he had military experience. Harold said, "Some." Blake pressed. Harold was quiet for a moment, then said he had been in Vietnam. Blake asked what he did there. Harold said he was a rifleman. There was something about the way he said it, flat and quiet and without any desire to elaborate, that made Blake pause. Blake had been in the army for 22 years. He had met a lot of veterans. He knew the difference between a man who wanted to talk about his service and a man who carried it like a stone in his chest. Harold was the second kind. Blake made a decision that he would later describe as either the best or the dumbest thing he had ever done on a range. He asked Harold if he wanted to shoot. Harold looked at the line of M2010 rifles laid out on the shooting mats and said he would not be comfortable with those. He said they were fine weapons, but he had not fired a bolt gun with that kind of glass on it in a long time, and he did not want to embarrass himself trying to figure out the reticle. Blake asked what he would be comfortable with. Harold pointed to a rack near the range shed where several older rifles were stored for demonstration and training purposes. Among them was a Remington 700 in .308 Winchester that looked like it had been dragged behind a truck. The bluing was worn to silver on the barrel. The stock had a crack running along the wrist that someone had tried to fix with wood glue. The scope was a Leupold Mark IV that might have been manufactured during the Clinton administration. Harold picked it up, worked the bolt twice, dry-fired it once with his eyes closed like he was listening to something, and said, "This will do." Several of the younger snipers exchanged glances. Torres looked at Paulson. Paulson shook his head slightly. The universal gesture for this is going to be embarrassing for everyone. Blake called the range hot. Harold walked to the firing line carrying the old Remington, like a man carrying a tool he had used 10,000 times. He did not rush. He did not hesitate. He lowered himself to the mat with the careful, deliberate movement of a man whose knees had not been young for a long time, settled the rifle into his shoulder, and became very still. There was no kestrel meter. There was no spotter calling wind. There was no dope card, no ballistic calculator, no rangefinder. There was an old man, a worn rifle, and 1,000 meters of desert air between him and a steel target. Stage 1, 300 meters. The rifle cracked. The target rang. Stage 2, 400 meters. Crack. Ring. Harold worked the bolt with a smoothness that Paulson noticed immediately. It was not fast. It was not flashy. It was mechanical, automatic, the product of repetition so deep it had become part of the man's body. Stage 3, 4, 5. 6. Every shot landed. Every target rang. Harold did not look up between stages. He did not adjust his scope. He held the rifle like it was an extension of his skeleton, and he simply shifted his aim point, breathing once, twice, and breaking the shot on the natural respiratory pause, like a man who had been taught by people who did not have the luxury of missing. The range was quiet now, not the quiet of a break, the quiet of people watching something they did not expect and do not fully understand. Stage 7, 900 meters. Harold paused for the first time. He lifted his head from the scope and looked downrange with his naked eyes for about 5 seconds. Then he reached up and made a single, tiny adjustment to the elevation turret on the old Leupold. 1 click, maybe 2. He settled back behind the rifle, breathed, and fired. The steel target 900 meters away jumped on its stand and sang. Corporal Vic, who was now glassing through a spotting scope with the kind of focus usually reserved for watching a surgeon operate, said quietly, "Center mass." Nobody responded. Stage 8, 1,000 meters. The half-silhouette was just a grey shape in the heat shimmer, barely visible to the naked eye. Harold did the same thing. Lifted his head, looked, adjusted. 1 click, settled, breathed. The crack of the rifle rolled out across the desert, and 3 seconds later the distant clang of bullet on steel came back, like an answer to a question nobody had asked out loud. "Hit," Vic said, and his voice had changed. It was not the voice of a spotter calling a shot. It was the voice of a man watching something he would tell people about for the rest of his career. Stage 9, 1,100 meters. The target that had defeated every sniper in the battalion for 3 straight days. The wind was still blowing from the south, still variable, still pushing 8 to 12 miles per hour across the range with that thermal updraft at 700 meters that Harold had described 20 minutes earlier. Harold did not lift his head this time. He stayed behind the scope for a long time, 10 seconds, 15. His breathing was slow and visible, the rise and fall of his back barely perceptible under the flannel shirt. Blake stood behind him with his arms still crossed, but his jaw was no longer set in frustration. It was set in something else. Anticipation. Maybe awe. The range was so quiet that Torres later said she could hear the wind moving through the scrub brush 50 meters away. Harold's finger moved. The rifle fired. The sound cracked across the flat desert like a whip. Everyone watched. Everyone waited. And then, from 1,100 meters away, came the clear, unmistakable ring of a .308 bullet striking steel. Dead center. The half-silhouette rocked on its mount and settled. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Vic lowered the spotting scope slowly and looked at Blake with an expression that was equal parts shock and reverence. "Hit," he said. "Upper chest, maybe 2 inches left of center." Harold worked the bolt one last time, cleared the chamber, set the rifle down on the mat with the muzzle pointed downrange, and stood up slowly, pressing one hand against his lower back as he straightened. He looked at Blake and said, "Your wind call was the problem, not your shooters. Those boys can shoot. They just need to learn to read the whole field, not just what's in front of them." The range stayed silent for what Paulson later estimated was a full 10 seconds, which on a military rifle range might as well be an hour. Then Blake uncrossed his arms, took 1 step forward, and extended his hand. Harold shook it. Blake asked him directly what he did in Vietnam. Harold looked at him for a moment, and something passed across his face. Not pride, not pain, but something old and heavy and private, and he said, "I was a scout sniper with 3rd Battalion, 26th Marines, Khe Sanh, 68. Blake's hand was still gripping Harold's. He did not let go. 3rd Battalion, 26th Marines at Khe Sanh in 1968 was one of the most brutal sustained combat engagements of the Vietnam War. The siege lasted 77 days. The Marines were surrounded, outnumbered, and under constant artillery, rocket and ground assault. The snipers at Khe Sanh operated in conditions that would be considered unsurvivable by modern standards, firing from exposed positions, often without support, at ranges that pushed the limits of the equipment they had, equipment far less capable than the rifles lying on the mats behind Harold. Blake released his hand and took a step back. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he turned to his platoon and said, "This man cleared a course that none of you could pass. He did it with a rifle from the storage rack and a scope older than most of you. and he did it because he learned to shoot in a place where missing meant dying. So I suggest you shut your mouths, open your ears, and ask him if he's willing to teach you something." Harold looked uncomfortable with the attention. He shifted his weight and glanced toward the parking lot like a man calculating the distance to his truck. But Paulson stepped forward first. Paulson, the top graduate of sniper school, the man whose pride had taken a beating all morning, walked up to Harold and said, "Sir, I'd be honoured if you'd spot for me on my next attempt." Harold looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. For the next 3 hours, Harold Creech stood behind the spotting scope and coached every sniper in Bravo section through the qualification course. He did not raise his voice, he did not lecture. He spoke in short, specific sentences. "You're reading the wind at the muzzle. Look at the Mirage at 800. See how it's tilting? That's your correction." Or, "You're rushing the trigger. The shot breaks when it breaks. You don't decide when. The rifle decides. You just have to be ready." Or simply, "Breathe. You're a shooter. Trust that." One by one, the snipers began to pass. Paulson cleared stage 9 on his first attempt with Harold spotting, and when the steel rang, he looked back at the old man with an expression that a generous person would call gratitude and an honest person would call something closer to wonder. Torres passed next, then Vic. By the end of the afternoon, 6 of the 8 snipers had qualified, and the 2 who had not were within inches of passing and would clear it the following morning using the techniques Harold had shown them. Word travelled fast on a military base. By the time Harold was getting ready to leave, a small crowd had gathered near the range. Among them was Colonel Voss himself, the man who had designed the new qualification course, who had driven out from the battalion headquarters after Blake radioed in the results with a report that Voss initially thought was a joke. Voss walked up to Harold near the parking lot. Harold was putting his visitor badge in his shirt pocket and fishing for his truck keys. Voss introduced himself and asked Harold about his service. Harold gave him the same short answers he'd given Blake. Voss, who had done his homework in the 15 minutes it took to drive to the range, already knew more than Harold was telling. He knew that Corporal Harold Creech had been credited with over 40 confirmed enemy kills during the siege of Khe Sanh, a number that placed him among the most effective Marine snipers of the entire Vietnam War. He knew that Creech had been awarded the Silver Star for remaining in an exposed position for 9 hours under direct enemy fire to provide cover for a platoon-sized element that was pinned down during a ground assault on the perimeter. He knew that Creech had been wounded twice during the siege, had refused evacuation both times, and had returned to his firing position with field dressings on his arm and his leg. Voss knew all of this because the records existed. Harold had simply never mentioned any of it. Not to his grandson, not to Blake, not to anyone on the range that day. Voss asked Harold why he never talked about it. Harold looked at him and said something that Voss would later repeat at a battalion formation. He said, "Colonel, I didn't do anything special. I had a rifle and a job, and there were men counting on me to do it. The ones who deserve the talking about are the ones who didn't come home. I think about them every day. I don't need anybody else to." Voss was quiet for a moment. Then he asked Harold if he would be willing to come back to the range. Not for family day, not as a visitor, as an instructor, a consultant, someone who could teach his snipers the things that cannot be learned from a manual or a ballistic calculator, the things that only come from experience so deep it lives in the bones. Harold thought about it for a long time, standing in the parking lot with the afternoon sun making the desert glow orange behind him, and finally said he would think about it. 2 weeks later, he called the battalion and said yes. Harold Creech returned to Fort Irwin the following month as a civilian marksmanship advisor, an unofficial title that Blake created specifically for him because there was no official one that fit. He came to the range twice a month. He brought the same flannel shirts, the same worn boots, and the same quiet authority that he had carried that first morning. The snipers called him Mr. Creech for exactly 1 session. After that, they called him Top, a term of respect for a man who had earned it in a place most of them had only read about in history books. Harold never spoke about Khe Sanh unless someone asked directly, and even then he kept it short. But on the range, behind a rifle or behind a spotting scope, he became someone else, not louder, not more animated, just more present, as if the act of shooting connected him to something fundamental in himself that 50 years of civilian life had never quite reached. He taught the snipers to read wind by watching grass, dust and mirage. He taught them to manage their heart rate through breathing patterns that no school curriculum covered. He He taught them patience, which he said was the single most important skill a sniper could possess, and the one that was hardest to teach because young people always wanted to rush the shot. And he taught them something that could not be quantified or measured, but that every shooter who trained with him recognized immediately: the difference between someone who shoots a rifle and someone who is a rifleman. The following quarter, Bravo Company's sniper section posted the highest qualification scores in the division. Every shooter passed the new course of fire, including Stage 9 at 1100 metres. Colonel Voss presented the results at a brigade briefing and mentioned Harold by name. The room, full of officers and senior NCOs, gave a standing ovation for a man who was not even present. When Voss told Harold about it later, Harold shrugged and said the boys did the work. He said he just reminded them of a few things they already knew but had forgotten, because they were relying on technology to do what their eyes and their instincts were built to do. Evan, Harold's grandson, the specialist whose family day invitation had started the whole thing, qualified as a sniper the following year. Harold spotted for him on his final shoot. When Evan cleared Stage 9, he looked back at his grandfather, and Harold gave him a single short nod. Evan said later it was the proudest moment of his life, not because he passed, because of the man standing behind him. There is a photograph now on the wall of the Bravo Company Sniper Section team room at Fort Irwin. It shows Harold Creech lying behind the old Remington 700 on that first morning, flannel shirt, worn boots, visitor badge still clipped to his pocket. Someone took it from behind the firing line without Harold knowing. Next to the photograph is a small brass plate that reads, Corporal Harold Creech, USMC, Khe Sanh, 1968. He taught us to see what the wind was doing, not what we thought it was doing. The rifle, the battered Remington with the cracked stock and the ancient scope, is still on the range. Blake had it cleaned but refused to have it repaired. He said it should stay exactly the way it was the day an old man in flannel picked it up, and reminded a room full of professionals what marksmanship actually looks like. Every new sniper who joins the section is told the story. Every one of them walks past that photograph on their first day, and every one of them learns the same lesson that Staff Sergeant Paulson learned on a hot Tuesday morning in the California desert: that skill does not expire, that experience cannot be replaced by equipment, and that the quietest person on the range might just be the most dangerous shooter you will ever meet. If this story reminded you that respect is earned in silence and proven when it matters, subscribe to my channel. We tell the stories that nobody else tells, about the people who carried the weight and never asked for the credit. Share this with someone who served. They will understand.